Chapter 1. Once upon an autumn, there was a young boy who thought Halloween was the coolest holiday ever. He just couldn't wait for the fall season to come. He was in a state of fanatical bliss when October 1st crept up each year. He was enthralled with all of the prospects and spookiness the holiday would bring with it. He truly loved the sights, sounds and smells of the changing season as summer started to die. The appearing of pumpkins was as welcome and tantalizing to him as new blossoming flowers might be for someone else at the birth of spring. It was no different this year, of course, and fall was shaping up splendidly. The colors in the trees were already proving magnificent in places. The late September breezes were blowing wistfully in the evenings in such a way that set his heart a-sail, dreaming of what this October would conjure. You see, Halloween was not only the coolest holiday ever as far as he was concerned, it was also his birthday. And, this year would be different, but he would never have imagined how different. This young boy's name is Benjamin, and this year would be different because he would meet Mr. August Mooney, and face something that only in his young imagination had hoped to encounter many times. When he finally did, he found that he would regret it for the rest of his life, which he is quite fortunate to still possess, I might add. You see, young Benjamin was infatuated with vampires, and he always dressed up as a vampire for Halloween. He had all the vampire movies, or at least all the ones his mother would allow him to watch. He read about vampires in every book he could get his hands on. No, Mr. Mooney is not a vampire, in case you are wondering, but Benjamin did meet a vampire. Lucky for him, he met August Mooney first. It was on October 1st that Benjamin and August crossed paths for the first time, in a cemetery no less. Just about a block and a half away from Benjamin's house sleeps a forgotten, old cemetery hidden near a grove of trees. The graves date as far back as the year 1822. It was Benjamin's yearly ritual to visit the cemetery in the evening starting on October 1st, and returning each evening thereafter until Halloween night. He would arrive at the cemetery about 6 o'clock or so, and sit on the old, crumbling concrete bench just on the edge of the cemetery's entrance. He would stay until the sun would disappear behind the houses across the road from the cemetery. Benjamin came hoping to see a ghost, or better yet a vampire. Benjamin's mom would not allow him to be out after dark except during this time of year, and only 10 minutes after sundown, then he had to be home. She only allowed this because she knew how much it meant to him, and the path to and from the cemetery was safe enough. It ran between the homes of people his parents knew very well. Also, except for those who lived close to the cemetery, no one ever went there. Either they didn't know about it, or it was forgotten to them long ago. The exception was a man who came once every 2 or 3 weeks and mowed the grass. No one seemed to know much about him. He just showed up, mowed the grass, and left. Sometimes he would walk back and forth mumbling to himself after he was done mowing. He had been doing this for years, and everyone who knew about him counted him as harmless. He never stayed after sundown though. If time got away from him and the sun was setting low, he would leave in a great hurry without his lawnmower and gas can. He would come back and pick them up in the morning. On this 1st of October, Benjamin began his yearly ritual as he had been doing for the last 3 years. He started this tradition when he was 10. He arrived at the cemetery at 6:15 this night because his mom made him clean his room before he left, which was usually a mess daily. This was a good time of year for his mom to get him to do whatever she needed him to do. If she even mentioned that he could not go to the graveyard until he did this or that, she knew she had him right where she wanted him. August saw him sitting there just after the sun had slipped behind the houses, and it was getting pretty dark. The night was clear and crisp. Under other circumstances August would have found it a lovely evening. August wasn't paying attention to Benjamin or the evening, he was watching the creature he had been tracking for 8 years. The tall, sleek figure was entering the graveyard on the far left side, and Benjamin hadn't noticed. That is not at all unusual, for this creature moves in such a silent, elegant manner that he seems to almost not be there at all. He just seems to fade into the scenery. His name is Leandro Bilassant. August has been on his trail ever since Leandro fed on August's beloved Anna. The beast left her lifeless body in a city dumpster, as though she was a paper plate full of chicken bones someone might toss in the trash after dining at a picnic. August has lost track of him a few times over the years but has always managed to find him again, for he is a creature of disgusting habits. He is slippery, but his trail is not hard to pick up if you have come to know him as well as August. August knew Leandro was aware of the boy and had wandered into the graveyard because of him. Leandro could have smelled the youth 400 or 500 yards away. He could have smelled August, too, for that matter, if August had not properly prepared himself earlier for the night's hunt. August snuck up behind Benjamin, who was quite relaxed and twirling a stick in his right hand. He lightly tapped Benjamin on the shoulder. You would have thought he had blown an air horn in Benjamin's ear the way he screamed and jumped straight up off the bench he was sitting on. August had no need to do so, because Benjamin was already on the move in the right direction, but he hollered out after him anyway, "Run, boy, and don't you stop until you get home. I mean it, you keep running. Your life depends on it." That is how Benjamin met, or rather experienced, Mr. August Mooney for the first time, and I can't imagine what was going through his mind. August knew he would see the boy again, it would be inevitable. Maybe he would apologize then for giving the boy such a fright. August had not taken his eyes off of Leandro throughout the ordeal. Even before he reached out to tap the boy on the shoulder, he saw the rage begin to swell in Leandro's fiery, red eyes. August was ready for a fight, but to his surprise Leandro turned himself away as if to convey, "You are not worthy of my effort," and disappeared among the trees. August did not catch up with Leandro again that night, but he took comfort in knowing that he had spoiled Leandro's plan. He also reveled in the fact that Leandro knew once again, August had not given up his pursuit. August doubted Leandro, was at all intimidated by that fact. He never has been before. Leandro considers August more of a source of entertainment than a threat. Chapter 2. Benjamin's mother was sitting on the couch watching TV when he burst through the front door, causing the cat to launch itself into the air in a frenzy of squalls and hisses. It now stood on all fours, its back hunched, and looking more like a porcupine than a cat. It had previously been lazily stretching, and beginning to nap in front of the door where it always does. Benjamin's father jerked his head out from behind the newspaper he was reading and looked Benjamin square in the eyes. Benjamin was quite familiar with this look. Before his father could compose a response to the ruckus, Ben's mother rose to her feet and hollered shakily, "Benjamin! What in tarnation is the matter with you? You nearly broke the door and killed the cat, not to mention gave me a heart attack." Ben's father looked satisfied with the scolding and went back to reading the paper. Ben was trying hard to catch his breath so he could tell her what was wrong. He started to talk but could not get out more than grunts and strange noises in between the gasps for air. He could not remember ever being this distressed in his whole 12, almost 13, years of life. His mother started to sound concerned for him now that the shock to her system had subsided some. "Benjamin, take time to calm down and tell me what is wrong," she said. Finally Ben gained enough composure to get some words out, but it was still quite difficult. He started with, "He yelled at me. Gasp. He said I was gonna, gasp. Die." At this his father put down his paper and asked sternly, "Who yelled at you?" The man at the cemetery. He said keep running and don't stop, or you're gonna die," Ben explained. The words were coming more coherent now but not easier. "What man?" his mother asked. "Was it Mr. Tanner?" his dad interrupted. I'll give him a piece of my mind. Imagine teasing a boy like that. He has always had a mean streak. I've said it 100 times. No, it wasn't Mr. Tanner. I don't know who it was. I was sitting on the bench and he touched my shoulder. I didn't know he was behind me. I jumped up and started running for home, and he said I'd better not stop or I was gonna die, Ben explained. I'm calling June, his mother said. I'll get to the bottom of this. I'm calling the police, his father said, as he headed for the bedroom to use the other phone. June was Mr. Tanner's wife and they lived just off the west edge of the cemetery. Ben's mother was convinced James E. Tanner had something to do with this. Ben's father never passed up the opportunity to call the local authorities and complain about a serious issue. Ben sat down on the couch and tried to get his thoughts together. He wasn't sure what to think. It could have been Mr. Tanner. He never did look back to see the man, but it sure didn't sound like Mr. Tanner, and it sounded like the man meant what he said. It would be a comfort to find out it was Mr. Tanner at this point, he thought. Just then Ben's father yelled from the bedroom, "And that's the last time you go hanging around that cemetery alone, Mr. Benjamin." That would have crushed Ben a few hours earlier, but just now he was kind of glad to agree. Later that night when all the clatter had died down, Ben's mother tucked him into bed and told him not to worry. Whoever that jerk at the cemetery was, he was bound to get what's coming to him. People like that always do. She was sure of that. In the back of her mind she still thought Mr. Tanner was to blame even though June and James denied it vehemently. It would be some time before the Hanson family and the Tanners would be more than civil to each other in public. Ben's father did not do much better with the local authorities. They said they would keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. That did not go very far with Ben's dad, but then again, he was never quite pleased with the local authorities. Chapter 3. The next morning, Ben was up with the alarm clock. He jumped in the shower and began getting ready for another day at school. He didn't give much thought to the previous night's events. He was thinking about the peculiar dream he was having when the alarm sounded. He dreamed he was at school, but he was all alone. The halls were dark and kind of foggy. Someone was calling out to him, but Ben couldn't get to where the voice was coming from. Every time Ben turned a corner he felt sure he would see who was calling him. Each time there was no one. The voice would begin calling again from what seemed farther away. The voice seemed odd to Ben. It seemed both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. It was a man's voice and sounded as though he was from a different country. His English was very elegant. Ben did not mention the dream at breakfast but was still dwelling on it when the bus pulled up. The bus ride to school was typical, consisting of the usual taunting from Big Arnie, Susie, and Linda taking turns making fun of him in one way or another. Normally this would bother Ben, but this morning he was preoccupied with last night's dream. It prevailed in his mind like a fog that would not be dissipated by the morning sun. Ben's day at school went mostly as usual, except for an afternoon event that had everyone in Ben's physical education class, and all who saw or heard of it later, in an uproar of amazement and concern. Mr. Bird, the Math P teacher, was violently attacked by Mike Meyer. On a regular day Mike was one of the nicest guys you would want to meet. Though usually very nice, Mike is quite large for his age and most treated him with respect for that reason alone. On this particular day, for some unknown reason, he decided he was not going to follow Mr. Bird's directions. He expressed that very decision by taking a swing at Mr. Bird. The swing would have caught Mr. Bird solid in the face, and sure to have sent him sprawling, if Mr. Bird had not been turning in shock at the deluge of profanity that preceded the attack. Mr. Bird stumbled out of the way over a baseball bat that was lying at his feet. It took some doing on Mr. Bird's part, but eventually he got behind Mike, got him under control, carried him to the nearest hallway trash can, and stuffed him head first into it. Mr. Bird then proceeded to drag the trash can, with Mike in it, to the principal's office. This would make for a very good story around the Hanson dinner table tonight. The bus ride home was much more pleasant, and it usually is because Big Arnie does not ride the evening bus. Susie and Linda generally keep to themselves when Arnie isn't around to back them up. After arriving home, Ben's mom met him with the usual barrage of questions about how his day went. Ben answered in short, benign replies designed to keep the communication to a minimum, and to get through the inquiry as quickly as possible. But then he remembered the fiasco that unfolded at school between Mr. Bird and Mike Meyer. He suddenly became very verbal as he excitedly explained to his mother the event of the year thus far. He went into great detail on how Mr. Bird avoided a near-death experience and literally picked Mike Meyer up, turned him upside down, and inserted him head-first into the closest hallway trash can. Every student had found a place to press their enamored faces to the glass of the entry door to the school as they watched Mr. Bird drag Mike in the trash can, legs flailing, to the principal's office. Ben did not hesitate to reiterate the entire story to his father at the dinner table. Once Ben had the floor, he went until he had relayed every detail and could think of nothing more to add. His father, and his mother for the second time, listened quite intently and provided all the oohs and ahs at just the right intervals to keep him rolling excitedly along with his tale. After dinner, as Ben's dad settled into his recliner by the imitation electric fireplace that resided right under the TV on the wall above, he said, "If I were the principal I would oust that boy and never let him back in the building. It's unbelievable what kids are getting away with these days." He stuck his pipe in his mouth, which he never lit anymore, and dove nose first into the paper that was lying on the table next to his chair. After his mother concurred, and went to her nightly knitting next to Ben's dad on the couch, there was little to no further meaningful conversation for the rest of the evening. Ben went off to his room to do homework, and to play some video games before bedtime. He did not even think about going to the cemetery for his October nightly ritual, and his parents did not seem to notice this as unusual. One would find this as very odd on both accounts if they knew how it was an absolute must the night before, and had been for the last 3 years running. If you were to see Mr. August Mooney walking along the road or moving about town, you may mistake him right off for a vagrant or vagabond. In all practical reasoning, you would be correct. But August is not your typical aimless wanderer as you may have already surmised. Neither is he destitute, as his appearance may suggest. Though he is quite detached from all the things in life that most would consider needful and normal, he is very well to do in the form of monetary resources. His current state of affairs is a chosen one, or at least a product of his own decisions. August used to darken the door of a corner office in a high-rise professional building smack in the middle of the Big Apple. He was not a New York-born native, but ended up there working for an engineering firm after a few of his personal projects became coveted, marketable products. He holds the patents to 3 such inventions that keep him well supported financially. He also had a very nice salary as the head engineer in charge of product development in the firm where he worked. That was until the day he took the last sip of his usual morning coffee, dropped the mug in the trash can next to his large mahogany desk, and walked out of the building never again to return. As far as August was concerned, everything he had accomplished was because his beloved Anna believed in him so emphatically. She truly made him feel like her knight in shining armor. The fact that she was so proud of him and all he had accomplished, was the only value the actual accomplishments really held for him. Without Anna to share the success with, there was no identifiable point to any of it. The relationship August shared with Anna was one of fairy tales. Anna met August when he was as poor as a church mouse. He was living in the basement of one of his college buddies' home. He was attending the local college during the day and working on his projects in the evenings. He had always been the tinkering type from the day he could walk. He spent his formative years taking apart anything he could get his hands on just to see how it worked. The rest of the time he spent creating new contraptions out of the items he had dismantled. The first time August saw Anna, it was all over. For August, everything about Anna was a pleasant experience. Her look, her walk, her smile, her voice, everything she said or did captured August's undivided attention. It had taken August roughly 5 years, from the day he met Anna, to rise to his position at the engineering firm. He and Anna had been married 3 years exactly, 3 weeks prior to his walking off the job. Anna had told August she was pregnant with their first child on the night of their anniversary. 2 days later August no longer had his beloved Anna or his anticipated child. The night after their anniversary she had slipped out just after dark to run around the corner to a local market. She was just going to pick up a few items they needed, while August was working away on a deadline for work at his computer. The area they lived in was a rather nice part of town and safe enough, or at least it usually was, under normal circumstances. Anna had been gone a particularly long time for a market trip. August took a break from his work and headed out to the market to join Anna and see what was keeping her. Arriving at the market, August was greeted with a hearty welcome from Jason, the store owner. August returned the pleasantry and asked if Jason had seen Anna, or knew where she had run off to. Jason responded that he was sorry, but hadn't seen her come in. August was struck with a slight panic, but it was not unlike Anna to change her plans and be off on a short detour. August bid Jason goodbye and headed back out the door towards their building. He was looking around for Anna as he went. He expected to see her in one of the other shops along the street. When he passed the alley closest to their building, he glanced down it, and felt his stomach lurch and his heart skip in his chest. He saw a red shoe that looked very much like one that belonged to Anna. It was lying next to the filthy, green dumpster that resides in the alley. He slowly walked toward it and picked up the shoe. He was sure it was Anna's, or at least one just like hers. He stood looking around in confusion, calling out her name once, and then the awful thought hit him. He had to look in the dumpster. Pausing for what seemed like eternity, he finally reached out his hand and brought up the grimy, nylon lid enough to peer inside. There are no words to describe what he felt when his eyes fell upon Anna's body crumpled at the bottom of the dumpster, her grayish, pale skin and her copious, blood-soaked neck and collar. He remembers throwing up and losing all control of his musculature to the point of falling head first to his hands and knees. Everything after that moment until he walked out his office on the 8th floor of the building in which he worked was nothing more than a blur. He did not even know why he had gone to the office that morning, except it seemed the only place to go to think. He could not be at home and think clearly. Clarity did come to him that morning in his office. It came in the form of an overwhelming commitment to vengeance. That would be his purpose now, and so it was the moment he left that office. He sniffed at the air like a common hound might do, gauging his surroundings. It was an attempt to determine if his target might be in the vicinity. His chosen evening meal generally presented himself about this time after he had finished his homework and evening chores. Leandro waited patiently for his meal to arrive. He was certain it would arrive soon, for now it had no choice. For the last 2 evenings the young man whom Leandro had been feeding on would exit through the side garage door of his home, and make his way to the old swing set in the backyard that he had well outgrown. He often came out after dark to sit in one of the swings. That is where Leandro had first encountered him. The boy used the swing set more like someone would use a rocking chair on their front porch than a swing set. It was just a place to get out of the house and think over the events of the day before his mother made him go off to bed. The first night, the young man never saw Leandro coming. Leandro slipped up behind, jabbed his large fangs into the boy's jugular while covering the screams with his cold, powerful hand. Normally Leandro would just devour the entire measure of blood in his chosen victim and discard the carcass wherever it behooved him. It was not that convenient in a smallish, rural town such as this. One had to be discreet. It is not prudent to have too many bodies piling up so quickly. Leandro could not risk drawing attention to his presence until he was able to accomplish his purpose for being in this pathetic, little burg in the middle of nowhere. He usually took up residence in a large city where he could go about his business with plenty of prospects, and ample dumping ground that harbored a lengthy, risk-free habitation. In a place like this it is best to feed modestly on a victim. The aim was to keep them alive as long as possible until the victim either passes from sheer weakness, or becomes totally useless. The victim's body would eventually deteriorate to the point of being unable to tolerate the nightly feeding activity. At that point the body must be made to disappear well enough to elude discovery for as long as possible. Then a new victim is chosen. Under differing circumstances Leandro would not concern himself so much with such things, but he had to remain in this place until his business was complete. He could not take the chance of missing this one opportunity that lay before him. He feared tonight would be the last night he would enjoy this particular choice of sustenance. The signs of weakness were showing rapidly in this victim, in spite of his initial robustness. Leandro will soon need to find another to feed upon. It is easy to be void of all sympathy for a creature like Leandro, but the truth is, like many other such creatures, he suffers a plight that is not of his own making. He, like this young man that currently serves as his means of satisfaction, had once felt his whole life before him. He became resource to a creature of the night back in the year 1753 when he was but a fresh 19 years of age. That makes Leandro 272 years old. Or maybe it is 253 years dead, depending on how one chooses to consider it. His unfortunate circumstance came about because, for whatever reason, the creature who fed on him did not see fit to finish the job. Leandro was left alive and infected with the victim's curse of becoming the disgusting leech he now is. He is not alive, neither is he dead in the common understanding of the term. He is instead cursed to exist forever insatiably and uncontrollably thirsty for one thing. He hunts continually for the relief provided only by the life force pumping through a living creature's veins. Leandro has discovered a way to end this horrific, twisted existence, however, and that is what forces his presence in this claustrophobic, little town. Chapter 4. The Hansons had just sat down to the dinner table for a tantalizing pot roast accompanied by a hearty side portion of macaroni and cheese. The macaroni was strictly for Benjamin's benefit. Ben's mom knew that any time they were having pot roast, it was best to throw on some mac and cheese if she expected Ben to eat much for dinner. Ben's dad did not waste any time showing his desire to start enjoying the evening meal. After a quick prayer was offered up for the bounty, he dove in with both hands. Just then the doorbell rang out, and the decorative plastic bell cover on the hallway wall fell to the ground with a loud clamor startling everyone, including the dog. Bentley, the dog, proceeded to bark frantically at the noise and the bell ringer simultaneously. He was not sure where to focus his efforts, but felt the need to sound the alarm to both occurrences for his beloved humans. Oddly enough, the cat that was stretched out on the couch in the front room barely seemed affected by the incident. "For heaven's sake, Bernard, I thought you were going to fix that thing," Ben's mom said, holding her chest. "I'll get to it." "Just slipped my mind," Bernard replied, still filling his plate with food and licking his fingers between words. Ben jumped to his feet to go see who was at the door. His mother hollered after him, "You are not leaving this house until you eat dinner, I mean it." Ben's mom had a pretty good idea who would be at the door, and so did Ben. Sure enough, when he flung the door open there stood a blonde-headed girl about Ben's age, pigtails and all. It was Brittany from down the street. Ben and Brittany had basically grown up together, meeting when they were around 5 years of age. They had formed a great friendship as young boys and girls do, but their parents took every opportunity to poke fun and let them know they hope it turns into much more as they get older. Both sides claim to hear wedding bells in their future. This is quite annoying to Ben and Brittany, but it has not hindered their friendship to this point. Ben stood in the doorway leaning against the door jamb. "What?" he asked. "Let's do something," Brittany said, as she rocked back and forth on her heels. "I have to eat first, Mom's rules," Ben replied, looking back toward the dining room. He was seeking a glimmer of hope that his mom might actually give in this time and let him go without eating. No such luck. "I'll be over as soon as I'm done," Ben assured her. "Hurry up," Brittany said, spinning around and darting off toward her house. Ben stood and watched her run out of the yard and onto the street, then headed back to the table. He was actually kind of hungry now that he thought about it. He went straight to eating the pile of macaroni his mother had scooped onto his plate next to the roast, carrots, and potatoes. He hardly noticed anything but the macaroni. He did have the casual awareness that he would not get away from the table without eating some of the other items placed on his plate. Ben's dad glanced up at Ben's mom, and then turned to Ben and said, "Someone mentioned at work today that a kid in town went missing last night. I think they said it was that Maya kid you told us about. Did you hear anything like that at school today? I assume that Maya kid was suspended and not there." "No, no one said anything like that about him," Ben said, with a mouthful of macaroni. "They did say he was suspended and would probably not be allowed back. That's what Mr. Bird said, anyway." Ben's mom jumped into the conversation. "Well, I can certainly imagine that. I feel terrible for his poor mother. She is a sweet lady, and the quiet sort. He probably ran away is my guess, trying to avoid the consequences of his behavior. He'll turn up soon enough," Ben's dad said, scrapping up the last bit of food from his first helping. There would certainly be another helping. The pot roast was going down easy tonight. That is not at all surprising. It usually does for Ben's dad. "I think I'll give Margaret a call and see how she is doing. She can probably use a friendly word. I think I still have her number from when we were on the church picnic committee," Ben's mom said. As interesting as the subject was, Ben was ready to forget about Mike Meyer and run down to Brittany's house. He shoveled in the last bite of macaroni, and started to rise, but was still waiting for the "sit down and finish your plate" speech. Ben's mom was off hunting up Mrs. Meyer's number. Ben's dad just gave him a glance and indicated he could hit the road. Ben did not hesitate to take advantage of the break that had come his way, and shot out the front door. When Ben arrived at Brittany's house, she was sitting on the front steps impatiently waiting. "What do you want to do?" Ben asked, half out of breath. "Let's go get a soda and head for the cemetery," she said, grinning from ear to ear. "I don't know," Ben replied. "My dad said I was not to go hanging out there alone." "You won't be alone, head, you'll be with me," she snorted. "Well, maybe, but I think he meant without an adult," Ben retaliated. "Well, maybe he did, but is that what he said?" she asked. "No, he just said alone," Ben admitted. "Okay then, let's go. I'll tell him I made you if he catches us," she promised. Ben reluctantly agreed. 1, because he knew his father would not approve, and 2, because he was still a little creeped out about the man who nearly gave him a stroke the last time he went. Ben had told Brittany the whole story about the man sneaking up on him at the cemetery, but she was not impressed. Brittany was hardly impressed with anything, and she certainly was not afraid. Nothing frightening, or even exciting ever happened in their little town according to her. That is probably what drove her to want to go to the cemetery. This was not the first time Brittany had gone to the cemetery with Ben over the years, but she bores easily and did not find his October nightly ritual as interesting as he did. She only went rarely when she had something she wanted to talk about, or something she wanted to get away from. This usually had to do with being in a fight with her older brother. Ben and Brittany headed for the nearby gas station to grab their favorite fountain drinks, then off to the cemetery they went. As Ben and Brittany approached the cemetery, the wind was starting to pick up a bit and it rustled through the trees with a lazy, comforting sound. It was as if the trees were yawning in preparation for another autumn night's slumber. A considerable number of leaves had fallen by now, and many found their way into the graveyard. Ben and Brittany watched them dancing and rolling on the grass, which had grown tall enough to sway and bend in the breeze. A particularly large, bright, orange-colored leaf was skittering across the top of the concrete bench Ben usually sat on when he came for his nightly visits. As he sipped at his soda, he thought how the leaf appeared to be alive and fleeing from their intrusion. Brittany began running toward the bench with the intent of catching the leaf before it could get away. Just then, the abrupt, disconcerting sound of an old push mower that was minus its muffler, startled Ben and Brittany out of their slight trance-like state brought on by the cool autumn breeze and the dancing leaves. It was the mysterious man who came from time to mow the cemetery's grass. He was on the far south side of the cemetery and went unnoticed by Ben and Brittany until the sound of the lawn mower jolted them from their mental leisure. They watched him for a while as he began to make rows back and forth across the cemetery. They watched mostly because he appeared to be mumbling to himself as he went. It struck Ben odd for some reason that the man was there and had started to mow so late in the evening. He would not have much time before sundown. After a bit, Ben and Brittany turned to look at each other and gave a simultaneous nod, which to them meant let's go back to your house. Your house, this time meant Brittany's house. Their relationship was to the point of needing very little verbal communication at times, and this was one of them. He stretched himself awake to the distant sound of a lawn mower running inconsistently. It definitely could use a tune-up. This thought was loosely intermingled with the realization that he would not need to go far for his nightly meal. It was just a hair's breadth away from sundown and the tight canopy provided by the trees still allowed ample protection from any remaining sunlight that might keep him pinned in place. Sleeping in the woods was something Leandro considered beneath him, but he has learned to do as needed. He finished his stretching and walked casually toward the tree line that opened into the east side of the cemetery. The sun had slipped fully out of sight behind the houses that were scattered at a distance across the road beyond the cemetery. He had complete freedom to move through the cemetery to where the man was loading his lawn mower into the back of his old, battered pickup truck, and so he did. The man was bending down to pick up his rusty gas can with his back turned toward Leandro. He did not hear the monster approaching. Mostly he did not hear because the rustling of the leaves in the trees were in his ears, and partly because he was still mumbling to himself. As Leandro approached the man, he suddenly stopped short when he heard the man mumbling, thinking he may not be alone. He thought he might be speaking to someone out of sight on the other side of the truck. After sniffing the air and confirming to himself the man was indeed alone, Leandro proceeded. Leandro slipped his left arm under the man's left armpit and placed his hand over the man's mouth and nose, jerking him upright. He thrust the man's head to the left and attached himself to the man's neck, leading with his needle-sharp fangs. The man hardly exhibited any signs of struggle, mostly from the sudden shock of it all, and because the speed at which Leandro was able to drain a victim of blood lulled them quickly into a state of lethargy. Leandro was tempted to finish the man, but fought the urge and decided to toss the man into the pickup truck. He would find somewhere to stash him until he needed to feed again. Leandro climbed into the cab on the driver's side and began studying the controls to quickly determine how to maneuver the vehicle. He was always intrigued how these contraptions had changed in design over the years, but somehow stayed the same. His favorite of all time was the 1908, Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost he had once taken a joy ride in after pilfering the life force of its owner. He drove through London with the owner propped up in the back seat, no longer among the living. Something about the owner of the Rolls-Royce made Leandro feel like the man had it coming to him. He remembers that night fondly. Leandro managed to get the truck running. After it stopped shuddering and belching out smoke, and he felt reassured that it would remain running, he drove off and found a secluded, dark street that had just what he was looking for. Leandro had discovered over the centuries that the sewer was as good a place as any to stash a body for future meals. Leaving the legs free to flail was usually enough for the victim to keep the rats off of them until he could return and feed. That wasn't always the case, but you win some and you lose some. Any street and manhole would do, as long as Leandro could go about his business unobserved. A glance at the floorboard let Leandro know he had the proper supplies for the job. The greasy rag that was shoved into the gasken spout, along with the well-aged roll of duct tape lying between the victim's feet, would serve nicely as a gag and sufficient ligature material. It was a crapshoot going about it this way, but if the man was discovered, succumbed to the rats, or wriggled free, there was a whole town for the hunting. August had secured a stay in the local excuse for a motel. He had cleaned himself up a bit in a nearby gas station bathroom before entering the office and registering with the clerk. Low profile was the name of the game, but very hard to accomplish in such a small town. The best he could hope for is to not draw too much attention by appearing greatly unusual or suspicious. After settling in with the small amount of items he traveled with, he indulged in a full refreshing clean-up that involved a long, warm shower and a well-overdue shave. He hardly recognized himself as he gazed into the mirror. He was always amazed at how much he would seem to have aged each time he went in for a full shave. The lifestyle he entertains does not encourage the passing of time to be lenient. He went to the tote bag he traveled with, that was lying on the bed, and pulled out a tattered, leather-bound book. He sat down on the edge of the bed and unlashed the leather cord that bound it. It was time to prepare for the night's activities. The book he held in his hand was no ordinary book. He received this book from a very peculiar man, for lack of a better term. The evening before he walked off his job located in the downtown, New York high-rise, he had received a knock on his apartment door. When he went to answer, he found an envelope that had been slipped under the door and no one on the other side when he yanked the door open. He is still not sure how the man was able to get into the building without being buzzed in. It is a very secure building with a doorman and all. But he knew it was certainly not impossible. He forgot to ask when he met the man in person. The note in the envelope simply said, "I am located in the shop around the corner from your building called Enchanted Dealings. I have some information of interest for you. Meet me tonight at 9 o'clock sharp after the shop closes. Knock on the door and I will let you in." August was quite curious and could only imagine that this intrusion had something to do with his recent state of affairs. It turned out he was quite correct, but not at all what he was expecting in terms of the nature of information he would be given. August had remembered seeing the odd little shop before, but never entertained the idea of patronizing it. He remembered thinking how it seemed out of place on the block it inhabited. He also recalled Anna telling him of her experience when checking out the little place once, but as he recalled, it was when he was working on a project and was not giving her his full attention. That thought caught him off guard and sent a sharp pain of regret through his heart of hearts. It provoked in him a vivid estimate of how often he gave his projects more attention than he did Anna. He felt an urgent need to follow through and see what the mysterious messenger had in store for him. As August approached the shop, he could see the owner flipping the open sign to closed. The owner spotted him, and a big, thin-lipped smile spread across his leathery face. Even at this distance August could see the sparkle in his big blue eyes that seemed to glow a bit because of their brilliant color. They looked quite out of place, but yet happily at home as part of his aged, droopy face. The shop owner enthusiastically pulled the door open and said, come in, with an exuberant come hither waving of his long, fingered hand. When August was inside the door, the man gazed into August's eyes a short moment. August started to reach out his hand to shake, but before he could bring it full up, the man turned his back to August and headed down through the middle of the shop, gesturing for August to follow. August remained in place for a brief moment, and then followed after the man. As the man approached the back of his shop, he placed his hand on the knob of a door that looked like it had not been opened in a good, long while. He turned his face toward August, which now had a much more serious look about it, and said, I have been following your unfortunate circumstances. I have some things you might be interested in. August just stood still looking back into the stranger's impressive blue eyes waiting for his next move. The man was very tall and easily stood a head higher than August. The man somehow seemed quite the opposite of threatening in spite of his unusual height. August stood at an even 6 foot and was not at all lacking in a capable appearance. The man turned the knob that appeared loose and flimsy in his hand, and entered the dark room. August saw the man's head pass through some cobwebs, but the man did not seem to notice. He was fixated on the task at hand. The man did not turn on a light or invite August to enter the room. He quickly grabbed a leather-bound book from a shelf on the right, and picked up a cane that was leaning in the inside corner by the door. He then stepped back out of the room, closing the door. He gestured for August to follow him to an area in the back, left corner of the shop where two dusty, winged-back chairs sat waiting to fulfill their purpose. The man plopped down into one, and August saw the dust rise up into the air. August thought how perfectly that fit with the ambience of the dimly lit, quaint, little shop. August took his place in the opposite chair, perching himself on the edge of the seat. The man leaned forward, almost too extremely, and began, Mr. Mooney, I know what happened to your wife. He paused briefly and continued, your wife did not meet her end by anything natural or common to man. After dropping this statement he settled slowly back into the chair. He assumed a lazy posture that somehow expressed he had been carrying a heavy burden of knowledge for far too long. He certainly had August's attention, but due to the nature of the experience thus far, August was not yet ready to give himself over to the man. August purposely kept himself suspicious. He only continued to listen out of intrigue, and with hope that this man might actually know something useful. The authorities had not presented anything of the sort, so far. He did not really expect that they would. In a city this size, crime easily eludes conclusion. The shop owner looked August up and down and started in again, what I am going to tell you will sound pathetically silly, but I assure you I am dead serious. He sat up a bit straighter and firmed up his grip on the cane that was in his right hand and proceeded, I hope you will do your very best to give me the benefit of the doubt. August gave the man a nod. The shop owner smiled a little and went on with his explanation. I was still here in the shop the night you found your wife in the dumpster. The man pointed to the window off to his right and continued, my window there provides view into the alley where she was attacked. When the police showed up, the lights and commotion alerted me to the ordeal. August was thinking to himself that the man was certainly not wasting effort on being congenial with his words. It suddenly dawned on August that he still had not been offered an introduction, and was unaware of the man's name. He felt if the man was going to continue being blunt in his approach, he should at least introduce himself. He certainly knew who August was and had him at a disadvantage. As if the man could read August's mind, he abruptly discontinued his line of conversation and declared, please pardon me Mr. Mooney, it occurs to me that I haven't even introduced myself. My name is Miles Andrew, I have been living in, and running this little shop for the majority of my adult life. August was taken aback and not a little unsettled at the man offering his introduction as if prompted by August's private thoughts. August forced himself to believe it was mere coincidence. August managed to respond with, "That's okay, Mr. Andrew, I would have inquired eventually. My wife, Anna, had mentioned to me she had stopped in once to check out your place." "Oh, yes," Mr. Andrew exclaimed. "She was very delightful, I remember her visit well." Mr. Andrew looked down at the floor as if he were avoiding having his emotions detected and quietly said, "I was utterly disgusted when I recognized it was her they were pulling out of the dumpster." When he looked back up at August, his eyes betrayed him. He could not hide the fact he was tearing up. "I was sure immediately when I saw her, that what I am about to tell you is true," Mr. Andrew said, shaking his head back and forth slightly. "Mr. Mooney, your wife fell victim to an ancient creature, no doubt you have heard of, but I am quite sure you have never entertained the idea of their possible existence." August politely asked, "So, what exactly do you believe attacked my wife, Mr. Andrew?" "For mercy's sake, please call me Miles," Mr. Andrew begged. "I believe. No. I know your wife encountered a faux devil." "Faux devil?" August reiterated. Miles leaned toward August and whispered, "An unnatural demon, or perhaps a more familiar term. Vampire." The look on August's face must have been transparent. Miles gave him a sideways look. "I know how it sounds, and what you must be thinking, Mr. Mooney, but I assure you I am not jesting in the slightest." August looked down at the leather book he was holding in his hand that had become so familiar and relied upon, as well as the cane standing in the corner of the hotel room. He recalled how right Miles was when he accused him of thinking the strange man telling him his wife had fallen victim to a vampire was a bit touched in the head. The book and the cane that Miles had given August were tools, ancient tools Miles had once utilized himself to aid him in what August was now undertaking. The book was a spell book that contained dimming spells to make one virtually undetectable to demonic entities and spirits. The cane concealed a special silver sword that had a spell etched into the long, slender blade. August still has not been able to decipher what the spell on the blade means, neither could Miles offer its meaning when passing it on to August. August did come to trust it worked well based on the times he actually got it in contact with Leandro's person. When he did so, Leandro let out an unbelievable horrid scream of terror. One day the blade will accomplish its purpose and relieve Leandro of his head. August has devoted his life to that particular mission. Tonight he will set out again to pursue its fulfillment, and try to bring this quest to an end, once and for all. Sometimes he wonders if he really wants it to end, when he contemplates how he will need to find new purpose for his life, once his revenge is satisfied, and his Anna and child have been vindicated. Chapter 5. The alarm clock rudely interrupted Benjamin's dream. He slowly slipped into the awakened state and clumsily knocked the clanging clock to the floor. He became increasingly more irritated as his awareness began to include the knowledge that this is Saturday morning. He should not be anywhere near awake yet, let alone being abruptly jerked into the day by an alarm clock that should not be going off. Ben would become aware later that his mother had set the alarm to make sure Ben was up in time to get himself ready. An hour and a half early has become the amount of time his mother believes Ben needs to perform this task. Today they were going to St. Charles to experience the decor and community events that occur there during the Halloween and Christmas seasons. Halloween was Ben's favorite, of course. This is a yearly ritual shared by Ben and Brittany's families. As Ben lay staring at the ceiling, the dream he was so rudely yanked from was flooding back into his mind. It seemed so real. It was still giving Ben the feeling that it may have actually happened, regardless of his certainty that it had to be a dream. He could still distinctly feel how the chilly breeze felt blowing across his bare arms. He was remembering having clear thoughts about why he was there without his coat, and wondering how he got there. There, being the cemetery. He had found himself on the far side by the tree line where he never has ventured before. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw that the grass was only partially mowed. He remembered thinking about the strange man that showed up to mow when he and Brittany were there last. He remembered feeling unusually sad when he had the thought that the man did not get to finish. He was having this thought while a faint voice started calling his name ever so gently. It did not worry him until he turned to gaze into the trees and began to make out a dark, hazy form moving his way. He could see the silhouette of someone in spite of it being in the middle of the night. The moon was very bright and full. He remembers taking note of that just as a random leaf flew in front of his face, startling him at the very moment the alarm clock brought him back to his bedroom. The recollection sent a fresh chill through his body, but that did not last long. It was at that moment his mom's head peeked around the corner and hollered, "Get a move on, kiddo, we don't want to leave a minute past 9. It was 7:34, according to the clock by his bed. "I don't know how I'll ever make it in time, I only have an hour and a half," Ben retorted. Ben passed his dad on the way to the kitchen. His dad was already dressed for the trip, and buried nose first into the newspaper. Just as Ben got past him, he came out from behind the paper and exclaimed, "Hey bud, they have a full-blown search and rescue out for that Maya kid. He still hasn't turned up. What do you make of that?" Ben paused to look back at his dad, shrugged his shoulders, and then went on toward the oatmeal he could smell waiting for him in the kitchen. His mother made oatmeal sweetened with honey and toast crumpled up in it for him. He has liked it that way since he was a small child. He loved the smell of it, and his mother knew it was a surefire trick to get him out of bed. The smell would bring him to his feet eventually, even on a Saturday. Ben managed to be ready on time in spite of his mother's doubts. She did not seem to notice or care that he had been ready and waiting a good 45 minutes ahead of schedule, and it was his mother who was rushing to get out the door on time. When she was finally heading out the door, it was exactly 2 minutes past the 9 o'clock deadline she had drawn in the sand for Ben. This is generally how it goes. If things continued as usual, they would find themselves waiting on Brittany and her family for another several minutes or so, before they would actually be underway. Things did continue as usual. The car ride was typical, but that did not mean boring. Ben's dad's personal goal was to have everybody laughing for a good portion of the trip. Every time the two families got together, it was a cut-up contest. They had shared many adventures together that always seemed to have something funny or peculiar happen. If you got them reminiscing, it was a laugh fest for sure. There was always the minor squabble over finding where to park when they arrived, and this year was proving a challenge. It was quite congested with attendees. All ruffled feathers were neatly back in place by the time all were out of the car and walking toward the anticipated excitement. Ben's dad was already sniffing the air for the smell of good food cooking on the outside grills. The festivities were in full swing. The sights and sounds were intriguing to say the least. This year's theme was famous people from the 1800s, and it seemed the entire town was dressed in character. That was Ben's mom's favorite part of the experience. Ben thought it was odd how he could overlook the visitors in modern cloths and mostly only notice the characters. He had a real sense of being in the past. The best part for Ben was the characters dressed in spooky attire. They had already passed a coven of witches casting spells over a cauldron, a werewolf, an ogre, and even a very well-done vampire, on which Ben was quick to offer his self-proclaimed, professional critique. "Very good indeed," he exclaimed. Ben and Brittany spotted a quaint, little shop that had all sorts of interesting things in the window, and asked if they could go in to check it out. The rest of the crew was watching the authentic-looking marching band that consisted of colonial-style soldiers playing flutes and marching drums. Ben's mom said, "Go ahead, we'll wait here." The door to shop gave a long, satisfying creak as Ben pushed it open. It would have been well placed in any scary movie, Ben thought, as he and Brittany stepped over the threshold. When the door closed behind them, it came alive with the sound of the clanging bells hung to alert the shop owner of entering customers. The shop interior proved as interesting as the items displayed in the window hinted. It was a mix of supernatural meets spiritism, with a satisfying atmosphere of spooky. Ben and Brittany walked through the shop gazing at the cleverly named potions, crystal amulets, and mystical figurines. Ben was specifically enjoying the small, medieval knight figurines made of pewter, when he heard a voice come from farther back in the shop. It sounded as if it was coming through the doorway just ahead of him. "Come hither, young ones," the voice cackled through the otherwise silent, seemingly abandoned, little shop. It was a voice of a woman, and when Ben worked up the courage to step through the doorway, in spite of Brittany grinning and shaking her head no in disagreement, he was pleasantly surprised to see an attractive woman that looked much younger than her voice portrayed her to be. He was expecting to see a bent-over, old crone. He turned back to Brittany and motioned for her to follow as he proceeded in the women's direction. "Sit, sit. Have a seat," the woman beckoned, holding both hands over a crystal ball that was poised on the table in front of her. "Sit and I will tell you of your future," she promised in the voice that did not fit her beauty. Ben and Brittany settled in as the woman increased her theatrics. The woman swooshed and swished her hands around the crystal ball and finally said, "Yes, I'm starting to see it now, you are brother and sister. I can see the two of you many years from now." Ben and Brittany looked sharply at each other and giggled rather loudly. "What?" the woman asked, almost slipping out of character for a moment. "We are not related," Brittany retorted in a tone that suggested, "No way, no how." "Oh, you did not let me finish," the woman replied, slipping back into character. "You are like brother and sister, even if you do not know it." Ben couldn't help but think it was a poor recovery, but he would play along. Brittany did not protest further at the woman's rebound, so the woman continued. The woman started to say something, and then looked as if she was startled. She peered into the crystal ball for what seemed an awkward amount of time. Ben and Brittany exchanged looks, raising their eyebrows at one another. Suddenly the woman began to speak in what must have been her normal voice. However, she was not speaking normally, she was obviously rattled by something. "I saw something. I saw something. I really saw something," she exclaimed loudly. "I'm not kidding, I really saw it," she stated again, looking up from the crystal ball. She was glaring into Ben's eyes and he was starting to feel uncomfortable. He managed to squeak out, "What did you see?" "I saw you. In the ball. I saw you for real. I only do this routine for the customers for fun, I have never really seen anything before," she said, as she sat there shaking her head back and forth slowly. Ben and Brittany continued to exchange glances, wondering if they should just get up and make their exit. Just before they acted upon the idea, the woman started in again. "You are Benjamin, and you are Brittany. Your birthday is on Halloween. Am I right? Am I right?" The woman seemed more excited now than startled. "Ah. Yes, that's right," Ben said, looking at Brittany and then back at the woman. "We didn't tell her that," Brittany whispered to Ben, as if the woman wouldn't hear her. Ben didn't respond, he just kept looking back and forth at the woman and then at the crystal ball. "I must tell you what I saw is confusing and not good," the woman said in a more serious tone. "You are in danger, but I can't really say how. It seems there is something hunting you. You mustn't venture out on your birthday." Ben just sat there not knowing what to think. He was still half thinking she was still putting on an act, but her face and tone did not give any hope of that. "You mean I am not supposed to go out on Halloween?" Ben asked finally. "That is exactly what I mean," exclaimed the woman. "There is something evil hunting you, and it can only get what it needs from you on Halloween, or rather, on your birthday." It was starting to sound like a lot of nonsense to Ben and Brittany again. Brittany stood to her feet, swatted Ben on the shoulder and said, "Ma'am, we need to get moving, we need to get back to our parents." "Yes," Ben agreed nervously. "They will be getting impatient. I'm sorry if I frightened you, but I had to tell you. I don't know what it means, but something about what I saw made it clear you must stay home on Halloween. Do not leave your house between the hour you were born and midnight of Halloween," the woman said, as Ben and Brittany made their way to the front door of the shop. "Okay. Thank you, will do," Ben hollered back as he and Brittany slipped through the front door and back into the sunlight. "So, that was weird," Brittany said, in an exaggerated manner. "Just a little bit," Ben fired back sarcastically. "Don't say anything to our parents, they won't let me go anywhere on Halloween. They probably won't anyway with what is going on with Mike Meyer missing, and the cops not finding that creepy guy who chased me out of the cemetery. I don't want to even get them thinking that way by adding this story to the mix. They wouldn't believe me if I told them anyway, but I understand," Brittany said. She then added, "So, you are actually going out on Halloween if they let you?" "Sure, you don't believe that mumbo-jumbo, do you?" Ben asked, half unsure of himself. "Well, I guess not, but she knew who we were and your birthday. How would she know that?" "Pretty convincing," Brittany reasoned. "She probably just got lucky. Hey, there's Mom and Dad." "Remember, Mom's the word," Ben said, grabbing Brittany's arm and steering her in their direction. He lay cold and still on the dusty picnic table that apparently serves as a makeshift workbench in this smallish basement. The space reeked of mildew and damp concrete. The sump pump sounded off in the far corner periodically with an obnoxiously loud whirring, followed by a slamming thump that punctuated the end of each effort to rid the basement of encroaching waters. He did not hear it. If someone were unfortunate enough to behold him, they would naturally draw the quick conclusion that he was dead, and for all practical purposes they would be correct. They would never imagine the mistake it would be to try and arouse him to be certain. His chest does not rise and fall with the exchange of breath, and his pale skin might convince anyone he is beyond animation, but if one should make an attempt to find out for sure, the consequences they would certainly encounter would make the greatest man wet himself and cry like an infant. Except for one tiny pinhole in the blind covering the only window in the basement, that produced a bright stream of light illuminating particles floating through the air that ended in a tiny dot on the far wall from where Leandro was slumbering, the basement was completely dark. After Leandro fed on the man he tucked cozily away in the sewer for future feeding, he went through the man's wallet in search of his address. He managed to locate the residence and discovered that the man was no doubt all alone in the world. He knew this to be true on several levels. After a quick inspection of the place from outside, ensuring no one else was home, he attempted to enter using the only other key on the keyring next to the truck key. He knew he could enter the home with no problem without the man's invitation because he now carried his blood in his veins. The fact that he was able to enter without any resistance also indicated that there was no one else that had official claim on the residence. He could also conclude, based on the contents of the meager little dwelling, that this man was most likely a committed recluse and void of all manner of human relationship. Leandro spent the remainder of the night rummaging through the little house and pretending he was William Arthur Daniels, owner and resident. Leandro often played at pretending he was normal, and such free use of a normal man's dwelling allowed him the pursuit of his fantasy. However, considering this man to be normal was probably a stretch based on the evidence at hand, but Leandro made do. His drive to be truly normal again is the very thing that brought him to this poor excuse for a town in the first place. He is sure he will soon enjoy the privilege of drawing breath into his lungs and feeling his own blood pump through his veins once again. He has decided he will either succeed, or finally let that pestilent, annoying huntsman take his head from his shoulders and end it all for good. He can't imagine hell being any worse than his current existence. It is the fear that it might be that has kept him enduring this long. For that matter, he has only allowed the huntsman to continue living for the very reason of having the option of letting the huntsman achieve his mission. If he is unable to be successful in his pursuit to reverse his curse, he may convince himself that an eternity in hell is worth the risk. It may be that, at least there, he would be his true self again. Chapter 6. Halloween was approaching quickly. In 2 short days Ben would be 13 years old and enjoying his favorite day of the year. It would begin with the traditional birthday celebration, which included cake and ice cream with close friends and relatives. Everything would be decked out in the spooky spirit of the holiday, and presents, there were always plenty of presents. At the age of 13, Ben felt he had outgrown the idea of running around the neighborhood dressed as a vampire, trick-or-treating. That didn't mean he didn't still really want to do it. He was more concerned with what his friends might think, especially Brittany. She had made it clear for some time she was not trick-or-treating with him this year. She had other plans. She said he was welcome to join her and her girl gang, as he liked to call them. They were usually involved in some sort of drama or mischief when they hung out together. Ben kept his distance when they were around for the most part, but this Halloween he was considering joining in with them. For at least 2 weeks Brittany and Ben had been sneaking a stockpile of toilet paper and eggs for the upcoming adventure that was sure to become their new Halloween tradition. It was not original in any way, but held new fascination and excitement for them. They were not as stealthy as they imagined themselves to be, however. Ben's dad had been privy to their planned escapade for almost a week now. He happened to stumble onto the large stash of economy brand toilet paper and 4 cartons of eggs hidden in the far corner of the garage behind a stack of lumber. He had not remembered putting anything in that area in lawn-size garbage bags, so he went snooping. He just chuckled to himself when he realized what he had discovered. He was quite the teeping terror in his day and decided not to let Ben or Ben's mother know he was on to Ben's scheme. He would keep Ben's secret for now. The night Leandro stashed away his leftovers in the sewer for safekeeping and availed himself of the man's humble abode, August went on the hunt to try and locate Leandro's whereabouts. He started by staking out the local city park. This has proven to be a frequent choice for Leandro to seek new dining prospects when in a new location. The city park would usually produce at least 1 or 2 unsuspecting patrons who chose to linger after dark. August knew it was a crapshoot for various reasons. Being that Leandro knew August had managed to follow him to this waste of real estate the residents have become accustomed to calling a town, and that August has obviously figured out what Leandro was up to, he would most likely avoid any semblance of predictable behavior. August thought it was possible that Leandro might either hunt the park closer to morning, thinking August would have given up and moved on, or perhaps out of desperation to quench his insatiable appetite, risk an encounter with August. August thought it might even be possible that Leandro would believe the park to be too obvious, and that August wouldn't waste his time looking for him there. All things considered, it was worth a shot. August found himself a place in the shadows. He propped himself against the outer wall of a dugout that was part of a deteriorating baseball diamond at the center of the park. From there he had a view of most of the park. It was not all that necessary to have a full view, for the cane he held firmly in his right hand would alert him if Leandro was approaching from a good distance. The long, silver blade hid within the shaft of the cane would begin to vibrate, with what August chose to believe was its enthusiasm at the possibility of finally passing through the demon's neck and relieving him of his head and conscious existence within this world. August had come to believe that he and the blade were comrades in pursuit of the same noble quest. As sad as it may be, At this point, the spell book and the cane sword were his only true companions and valued possessions. He did have a worn picture of Anna that he kept in his pack, but rarely bothered to look at it anymore. It was well burned into his mind and there to reference any time he would choose, which he found himself doing frequently. August entertained himself by watching 3 boys off in the distance playing a late-night game of basketball. Occasionally he would avert his attention to a passing car or bicycle rider. He noticed one jogger who passed through the park before he decided to close his eyes and drift off a bit, his hand firmly holding the cane of course. Leandro's eyes sprang open as if on a timer. The damp, musty basement was pitch black. The pinhole in the shade no longer offered its stream of light that stretched across the meager space. Leandro sat up with one smooth, elegant motion. He hung his legs over the side of the table, and left it with a quick hop to the floor. He took a fast look around the basement. It was as easy to observe for him, as if he were outside on a sunny day. That is one perk that came with this horrid curse. Vampire lore leads people to believe those of his kind avoid sunlight because it would kill him, but the truth is, the sunlight is excruciatingly painful to a vampire's eyes, even when their eyelids are closed. They are as good as blind and rendered helpless in the sunlight. The moonlight is perfect however, and like the bright sun is for normal humans. Leandro paused to watch a scrawny mouse in the far corner that was eyeing him, seemingly deciding whether to run to safety as fast as his little legs would allow. There was a day when the mouse might have been in danger back when Leandro was experimenting with alternative sources for sustenance. Leandro's experiments were short-lived, for anything other than fresh blood from a human proved to be comparable to drinking spoiled milk, and left him hungry again in a matter of a few hours. He did his best, but gave up the notion realizing human blood was to be his only realistic recourse. Leandro trotted up the rickety stairs eager to go into the night and check on the leftovers he stashed in the sewer the night before. It was a beautiful night, and he was very hungry. Leandro hopped in the old, rusty truck pulling the door shut only to realize he had left the keys on the kitchen counter. He flung the truck door back open, almost snapping it off the hinges. He is always testy and on the brink of rage before he has the opportunity to feed upon waking. After Leandro was able to get the truck to continue running after a few starts and stalls, he headed for the secluded street and manhole where his fresh supply of blood hopefully still waited alive. Leandro steered the truck down the dark abandoned street and pulled just past the manhole cover. He hurriedly slipped out of the truck leaving the door open and the truck running. The truck started to roll forward. Leandro reached in, grabbed the steering wheel, and held it in place. He reached in with his other hand and jerked the gear shift into park. Leandro walked to the manhole cover, stuck 2 fingers into the cover's lifting hole and picked it up, setting it aside with minimal effort. In one smooth motion he was descending the grimy, wrought iron ladder. Leandro knew even before he removed the manhole cover his prisoner was still alive. He could smell his breath and flowing blood, among the other aromas present, when he stepped out of the truck. As Leandro turned from the ladder toward the man bound with duct tape, he saw the man's eyes grow wide. It was hard to tell whether the man's expression was a product of terror or excitement at the thought of being rescued. Leandro was hoping it was terror. He has grown fond of the subtle flavors intense fear adds to a victim's blood. Leandro was feeling merciful tonight, and extraordinarily famished. He would finish this meal off fully and swiftly ending the man's plight. Leandro kicked the rat away that was busying itself around the man's bound feet, reached down jerking the man up, shoved the man's head to one side, and proceeded. Chapter 7. Ben and Brittany sat on the stone bench at the cemetery. It was midday, so Ben didn't feel he was violating his father's orders too severely by being there again. Also, he was with Brittany, so technically he wasn't alone. They had decided this was a good place to meet and hash out their plans for Halloween night. With October coming to a close, the day was rather on the chilly side, with occasional gusts of wind adding to the chill. Brittany pulled her coat around her more tightly as she said, "I am meeting up with the girls around 9 at Jen's house. We can meet you here by 20 after. Will you be able to get here with the stuff by then, or will you need help?" "I can manage. I'll make 2 trips if I need to. I'll start moving things this way around 8:30, Ben said. "You don't think you'll get caught making 2 trips?" Brittany asked. "Nah, my parents are none the wiser. My official birthday party will be over by 8 and they think I am going trick-or-treating as usual with you," Ben assured her. "What if they catch you leaving with the supplies, or coming back for more?" Brittany persisted. "No worries, I'll leave out the front door in full costume and head toward your house. When I know they are not watching, I'll circle back and get the stuff by way of the back garage door. I'll make sure I take the trash out before I leave so they have no reason to go out there, it's foolproof," Ben explained. "If you say so, just be sure to ditch the costume before I get here to the cemetery with the girls. You don't want them to see you in that," Brittany insisted. "Well duh," Ben said, secretly wishing he could still wear it one last year. It seemed sad to let it go. "All right then, it's a plan," Brittany said, sticking out her hand to shake. They shook on it and headed back toward their houses. They didn't talk much on the way. The wind was picking up and they focused their efforts on walking quickly and holding their coats tight around themselves to keep out the chill. When they came to the parting of ways, they gave each other a nod that meant "see you tomorrow night." Ben stood in place for a moment watching Brittany walk away. He headed off to his house when he got the feeling she may turn back and catch him watching her. What would his excuse be for that? On the night of the 30th, August had taken up residence in the garage of a house located behind where Ben lived. The house was for sale and vacant. He figured it was worth the risk and there was no need to break and enter, for the side garage door was unlocked and welcomed him in. He saw no reason to go looking for Leandro so close to time, because he knew exactly where he could find Leandro on the night of Halloween. The trick would be to catch up with him before he could succeed with his purpose. It may be that Leandro would show up early to keep an eye on his prey, or even abduct the boy for safekeeping until the intended hour. He was certain Leandro had not already done so, because August had observed the boy coming back on the path from the cemetery. August watched Ben enter his house through the gated backyard and decided to take a little snooze, so he would be alert for tonight's watch. As he drifted, the thought came that maybe he should warn the boy ahead of time. He assured himself the boy would never believe him, and it would surely ruin any chance he had of protecting him. More so, it may interfere with his real goal of ending Leandro's life once and for all. Leandro leaned casually against the wall inside a public restroom that was located in the middle of the city park. As Leandro was strolling into the park looking for a quick meal, he overheard a young man, from a good distance away, announce to his comrades that he had to relieve himself. The young man did not use that terminology, of course, and Leandro was always put off by the continuous disintegration of language used by each generation he has endured since the passing of his own. It was seemingly certain to him that people were, for unknown reasons, reverting from civilized beings back toward vulgar barbarianism. It actually gave him some solace in preying on humans for food from this era. They appeared to him, in many ways, as inferior life forms. When Leandro heard the lad approaching, he slipped into the stall closest to the urinal. He mused himself as he watched a healthy-looking spider scurry off to the adjacent stall under the divider. He thought how much he and the spider had in common and wondered if the spider's victims expressed as much terror as Leandro's chosen sometimes did. Leandro waited for the boy to get in position, and more subtle than a whisper, Leandro was behind him at the boy's ear. He gently said, greetings." The boy was frozen with sudden fear at the shock of Leandro's presence unannounced and so close. Leandro grabbed the boy's curly blonde hair with his left hand, firmly held the boy in place with his right hand grasping the boy's shoulder, and sank his long canines into the young soft neck. Leandro indulged himself on what he calculated to be about half of the volume of blood the boy contained. Keeping a firm grip on the boy's hair, Leandro reached into his vest pocket and brought out a pearl-handled, stiletto switchblade. He skillfully guided it through the boy's neck where his fangs had punctured. Leandro folded and pocketed the knife with one hand in a smooth motion. He then slammed the boy's head into the porcelain urinal. He let the boy fall to the ground at his feet to finish bleeding out. The intent was to have the boy appear to be a victim of human violence and not the remains of a vampire's feeding. It would take a clever detective to surmise the amount of missing blood from the victim. He was not too worried this town would possess such a worthy opponent as that. He was sure it would become an unsolved mystery the town could entertain itself with for years to come. As Leandro slipped unseen out of the restroom and back into the night, away from the lighted city park, he relished that tomorrow night would be the last night he would be forced to live as a monster. He would find the descendant, pierce his jugular, and be human again. Chapter 8. Ben's alarm went off at 0800 and brought him up out of a deep slumber. It took him a little while to awaken enough to remember what day it was. As he came to the realization that it was his birthday, and better yet, Halloween, excitement filled him and he came to himself much faster. He rolled out of bed and headed for the kitchen where the familiar smell of oatmeal and warm honey filled the air. He often enjoyed his favorite breakfast of oatmeal and honey at the hands of his mother, but on his birthday, it always seemed a bit more special. Maybe it was because he knew he could count on it for sure. Ben's mother greeted him with a jubilant, "Happy birthday, Mr. Teenager. You are now official." "Yes, I am finally 13, and on Halloween no less." "How many people get to say they turned 13 on Halloween?" Ben stated enthusiastically. "Not many, I'm sure of that," Ben's dad added emphatically, as he strolled into the kitchen. "Happy unique birthday. Let's hope it brings you good luck, and not bad," his dad said smiling. "Stop that," his mother warned. "There is only good in store for our Benji." "Yes, I am sure of it," his father recanted quickly, raising his eyebrows at Ben after his wife turned to retrieve Ben's large bowl of birthday oatmeal. "Any special plans for such a Halloween as this?" his dad asked, winking. "No, not really," Ben replied, suspicious of his father's gesture. Surely his dad was not aware of his plans of mischief. "Just the usual trick-or-treating. Thought I would see if Brittany would want to get together after and watch Fright Night at her house." Ben lied, in an attempt to throw his dad off the scent just in case. Fright Night is Ben's favorite vampire flick. His parents should easily believe that is what he would want to do. In fact, that is what he really did want to do if he were to be honest with himself, and Brittany. The only thing that would make it better is if he could actually watch it in the cemetery while watching for a real vampire. But this year he would go with what Brittany wanted to do. She had certainly indulged him many times over the years, and he couldn't help but feel she was right when she said he was too old to be running around in a vampire costume. "We have the usual attendees coming for cake and ice cream around 6, make sure you are here then. You have some cool presents to open this year," Ben's mother said. His mother always said that, but it was generally true. One of the first, really, cool gifts he could remember getting was an authentic-looking vampire cloak that has remained part of his Halloween costume over the years. It was big on him the year he got it, and it is rather small for him now, but he still loves it just the same. It is made of what seemed like real silk, black on the outside and blood red on the inside. Sometimes over the years he would wear the red on the outside to be different, but he was always a vampire for Halloween, and always wore his cloak. Every time he put it on, it made him feel like the real deal. He would wear it again this year, but only to convince his parents that his plans this year were no different than any other. Make sure you don't wander too far this year when trick-or-treating, and you and Brittany keep an eye on each other. They never did find that Maya kid. Or that lunatic that you ran into at the graveyard, Ben's dad instructed. Yes, sir, Ben replied respectfully. He never called his dad sir, but somehow it felt right for the moment. August slowly awoke. As his surroundings came into focus, he became acutely aware of the cockroach meandering upon the tip of his shoe. The roach's little antennae were seemingly waving hello to August, welcoming him back to consciousness. August let out a strange noise that adequately expressed how startled he was, while simultaneously flicking his foot in a violent motion that sent the poor little roach flying into the air, and landing on the garage's concrete floor a good 10 feet away. August jetted to his feet faster than one would expect someone of his age to be able to do. He was immensely awake now. He sprang into action, checking himself over from top to bottom the best he could for any other possible unwelcome violators of his person. As he came to a stop, he realized how silly he must look and was almost embarrassed, even though no one was around to see his antics. In that moment he was taken back to the day that Anna had discovered August had no affinity for the creepy crawling forms of life. August was diligently working at his desk, lost in thought over a project that was nearly finished, when such a life form came into view from behind his laptop. August shot back in his chair, almost tumbling over backwards into the floor. He was not even aware that he had let out a holler that, along with the chair-tumbling ruckus, brought Anna running from the kitchen to see what might be attacking her beloved. Anna saw August disheveled and wide-eyed. She exclaimed, "What? What is it?" "A major spider, that's what." August retaliated. "Where?" Anna asked, starting to giggle. "By my laptop on the desk." "It's not funny, it's huge," August said, defending his actions. "Okay, I'll have a look, it's gonna be fine," Anna said, obviously poking fun at August's behavior. Anna walked to the desk and, to August's utter horror and dismay, reached out and picked the monster up and held it as if it were cute. "Or, look, it's just a friendly little cricket," Anna said, holding it up for August to see. Beginning to feel hopelessly ridiculous, August came a bit closer and asked, "Are you sure? It looked like a spider to me." "Yes, I am quite sure." "Want to hold it?" Anna responded teasingly. "No, I do not," August assured her. "Okay then, I'll just let him out the front door." "No worries, you can go back to work now," Anna said, grinning from ear to ear. August couldn't help but chuckle now that the trauma had left him. August heard about that incident more than once throughout their time together. The anguishing thought just hit him that he had finally lived it down. Anna would never again tease him about his fear of spiders. Spiders. August's thoughts were returning to his current circumstances, and that brought him to vampires. August may be easily startled by spiders, but not vampires. He couldn't wait to get his shot at removing that creepy crawler from existence. If he could crush him like a bug he would, and tonight will be the opportunity he has been looking forward to for some time. August will be sure to prepare himself well and early for tonight's adventure. He still had a few hours before sundown. Last night was disappointing with no sign of Leandro, but tonight he will not fail to show. Chapter 9? Ben's birthday celebration was full of the usual yearly expectations. He received plenty of hugs, kisses, cards, well wishes, and gifts from all in attendance. Most gifts this year were in some form of money, whether hard, cold cash, or gift cards for various sites where Ben liked to buy stuff. There were the inevitable few items of clothes that were always easily identified on picking them up to open, but not over the top, just a few. And, it was cool stuff he liked, even the socks. There was one gift in particular that met the super cool ranking, and that was the new Lamborghini hoverboard that he had been begging for ever since he saw one at the mall last Christmas. He never thought he would actually own one, and now he did. Ben spent most of the time remaining at his party checking out the hoverboard, demonstrating his hover skills, and letting others have a turn. When 8 o'clock rolled around, Ben started to turn his focus toward the responsibility of tonight's mission. He began preparing everyone for the idea that he would soon be getting into costume and heading off to Brittany's to begin his usual yearly trick-or-treating extravaganza. It's not that anyone needed to be informed, they were all quite familiar with the drill. Ben would head out and everyone would stick around for additional slices of cake, ice cream, and indulge in the telling of some, or all of the same old stories and tales of past experiences as they always did. Ben's birthday was the ideal catch-up time for family and friends. Ben disappeared to his bedroom to begin putting on his costume. It had been laid out on his bed by his mother sometime throughout the festivities. For whatever reason, she enjoyed doing this for him as part of his birthday proceedings. He almost had a twinge of guilt when he thought how he was only putting it on to fool his parents into thinking he was going trick-or-treating as usual, when in fact he was going on a teeping rampage this year. Little did he know his father was in the living room whispering the whole deception to everyone there except Ben's mom, who had stepped into the kitchen to dish out a few more requested slices of cake. One of the slices was for Ben's dad, of course. Ben's father did not want to spill the beans to his wife how he had discovered the stashed contraband of toilet paper until Ben had a chance to hit the road. If he did, he feared Ben may not make it out of the house. Ben finished dressing up and thought about skipping the makeup, but decided he must be convincing. He did not want to cause suspicion. He put on his makeup, checked himself in the bathroom mirror, and made his grand entrance. Everyone made a big to-do over how great he looked, and he himself thought it was the best he had ever done. Too bad it was all just a ruse. Okay, I'm off. Into the night I go to terrorize all and feed on the blood of whom I choose, Ben declared. Everyone gave a chuckle. He said this every year upon his departure into the night. This year there were some raised eyebrows and tongue-in-cheek gestures shooting around the room, for they were privy to Ben's plans of mischief. "Do you have your flashlight?" his mother asked. "Yes, Mom, I have my flashlight," Ben said, waving it in the air for proof. "Stay with Brittany and don't go to any strange houses," his mother instructed. "Yes, Mother, I know, I do this every year," Ben replied, with annoyance thick in his tone. Ben's sister bent forward and whispered into her dad's ear, "No, he doesn't." Ben's dad let out a hearty laugh. The joke was lost on Ben and his mother. "Okay, I forget you are a big teenager now," his mom said, causing more embarrassment. His mom handed Ben his trick-or-treat pumpkin he had been using for years to gather the spoils of candy from his terrorized victims, and a thought dawned on him. He had not thought about the candy. How was he going to explain coming home with no candy after a night of trick-or-treating? He would just have to figure that one out later. Brittany will probably have a plan, she usually does. This was her deal anyway. Ben said thank you to all again for the presents, endured another round of hugs, and headed out the front door. He walked along as casually as he could for a good distance, until he was sure no one from home was watching him. He doubled back behind a neighbor's house and headed for the back garage door of his house where the stash of toilet paper and eggs were waiting. August had been watching the house to make sure Ben was still at home through the gaps in the backyard fence. He could see clearly into the kitchen window, a backsliding door that exited onto the backyard deck from where he stood. He could see right through to the front door and would know if and when Ben would leave the house. When August saw Ben leave out the front door, he made his way around through the side yard between the houses to get an eye on Ben. When he peered around the corner of the neighbor's house, he saw Ben turn and go into the yard on the far end of the house he was peeking from. August went back the way he came to try and keep Ben in his view. When he reached the back corner of the house, he saw Ben coming straight for him. He ducked back quickly and ran back to the front corner of the house to wait and see what Ben was up to. Ben turned between the houses, and just when August thought he would have to make another run for it, the boy went to the garage door of his house and very stealthily turned the squeaky knob and went slowly in. It was obvious to August that the boy was sneaking back into his house, but he could not imagine why. Ben paused to listen and make sure the coast was clear. He could hear the faint rumblings of conversation coming from inside the house and assumed all was carrying on as usual. He flipped on his flashlight and made his way to the place where he hid the night's supplies. As quietly as he could, he picked up the black trash bags and carried them outside of the garage. He sat them down on the concrete slab outside the door and went back for his little red wagon. It had not seen the light of day for years, but would serve his needs well tonight. Ben placed the bags securely in the wagon and proceeded to the back of his house. He made his way along the backyard fence between his house and the empty house where August had been watching him from for last couple days. He then headed for the path that led to the cemetery. Ben didn't have his watch on but figured he had plenty of time to reach the graveyard, ditch the costume, and wait for Brittany and the girl gang to arrive. August followed Ben carefully as to not be discovered. He was battling with the idea that he was using Ben as bait to achieve his own agenda. He kept reassuring himself that this was best for all. If he were to try and warn the boy of what was going on, he would possibly lose his chance to destroy Leandro once and for all. He may keep the boy from Leandro by warning him, but Leandro would move on again fiercer and angrier than ever. Who knows how long before August would get another chance to end his horrific, murderous existence. The worst-case scenario would be if Leandro would succeed in drinking from the boy, thereby reversing his curse and passing it on to the boy. What would August do then? Kill them both? At that point, killing Leandro would be only for revenge, and the boy, how could he kill that innocent boy for something he had no control over? Then the thought hit him, Leandro was probably no different from the boy at his evil conception. How much of what Leandro has done has been within his control? No, he must stop this thinking and focus on the task at hand. He did not create any of this, he is just here to end it. August had been so deep in thought that he had not realized immediately that the blade within the cane sword he carried in his left hand begun to hum and vibrate. Leandro was near. August stopped and began surveying the area in all directions while maintaining his watch on Benjamin. Ben was still moving toward the cemetery with his wagon in tow. Ben was but a stone's throw from the cemetery now. August began to hurry his pace to get closer to the boy so he did not pass out of his sight. August kept his head on a swivel watching for a surprise attack from Leandro. After Ben makes the next turn past the last house, it is but a short distance to the stone bench where he is to wait for Brittany. At the entrance of the cemetery there is an old gate that gave up its purpose long ago. The gate lays permanently open, barely cleaving to the leaning fence post by rusted, crippled hinges. Just beyond that stands a very old and large gnarled tree. Behind it, out of Ben's view, Leandro was leaning against the tree waiting for Ben's approach. Leandro had easily tracked Ben to this place of ambush. All he had to do was follow his scent. Leandro picked it up from halfway across town and merely let it lead him here. Ironic, he thought, being the place where he first picked up the boy's scent upon arriving in town. Ben strolled through the old gate pulling his wagon and began to get a funny feeling. It was dark except for the glow of the moon, and his flashlight beam. He was a little apprehensive of the dark, but this was a different feeling, something like stepping into a vortex that instantly made him feel lethargic and peaceful somehow. He was the opposite of frightened. He felt at home and safe. He was still aware enough to consider how unusual it seemed. Things seemed to slow down and he was suddenly very sensitive to his surroundings. The darkness struck him as being like thick velvet draped over the graveyard before him. The breeze seemingly flowed around him like cool sweet-smelling water. At that moment he heard a gentle voice. "Hello, young master, I have waited a long time to meet you on this night of nights," Leandro said, stepping out from behind the tree that kept him from view. "Come closer," Leandro beckoned. To Ben the voice seemed so familiar, but he was sure he did not know this man. The voice made him feel warm and safe. Ben was compelled to go to the man. As Ben dropped the tongue of the wagon and walked toward the man, Leandro held out his arms in a welcoming gesture and said with a smile, "I like your attire, how unusual it is." Just then August, who had been observing the exchange and working his way within striking distance, made his move and hurled himself at Leandro. He did not have a clear swing at Leandro's neck due to the boy's position, so he decided to make a straight lunge with the blade aimed at Leandro's throat. If he was successful, he was sure it would incapacitate the beast long enough for August to gain the advantage and finish the job. Leandro sensed the attack just in the nick of time. He reached out, grabbing Ben by his collar with his left hand, and threw his other hand up toward August's attack to fend off the blade. The long, sleek, silver blade caught Leandro in the middle of his right palm and pierced it clean through, with the tip pinning Leandro's earlobe to the side of his head. So close, but... Leandro let out a scream that indicated what he felt was far more pain than any mere blade through the hand and ear might take credit for. As if that weren't cause enough to scream, Leandro's expression was somehow supernatural, spiritual even. It almost made August feel sorry for him. For a second, August ripped back the blade to make another thrust, removing it from Leandro's person. August knew he must keep Leandro's attention on him and off the boy to keep him from biting the boy in desperation of achieving his purpose. August hoped Leandro would see the futility of reversing the curse with August there, determined to strike him down afterwards. On the other hand, he may settle for dying as a man instead of under the curse of a monster. As August made his next attempt at jamming the blade into Leandro's throat, Leandro did what August hoped he would do. Leandro let go of Ben and turned his complete determination toward August. Ben fell at Leandro's feet in a stupor. He was unable to right himself and make a run for it. He just watched on with wide, vacant eyes. There was no time for August to readjust his attack to a swing that would seek the removal of Leandro's head, so he proceeded with thrusting the blade at Leandro's throat with all the force and determination he had within himself. He yelled, "This is for Anna," as his arm propelled the blade towards its mark. Unfortunately, Leandro's speed and strength were astonishing by any standard, and though he was no match for the enchanted, sliver blade, he was largely superior to the mere mortal who wielded it. Leandro successfully caught August's arm with his left hand and the blade with his right, which had already mostly healed up from the first encounter with the dreadful blade. To August's surprise, Leandro threw his head back and screamed like he did when the blade pierced his palm. Apparently just the touch of the blade to the monster's skin was unbearable. Nevertheless, with one mighty motion Leandro jerked the sword from August's hand and flung it deep into the dark cemetery. Leandro grabbed August with his right hand that seemed to be smoking. August caught the smell of burned rotting flesh as Leandro began shoving August toward the old, gnarled tree where he was sure to be slammed and thrashed against until dead. Before Leandro could cover the distance between them and the tree where he meant to end the life of this annoying, pathetic, human, another figure streaked from the darkness and slammed into Leandro, breaking his grip on August. The impact sent August reeling and he landed on the cool grass dazed and confused. What he saw when his faculties returned to him, were two men rolling in and out of the shadows heavy in the throes of battle, but the sounds coming from them were of two large animals, each desperately trying to tear the other to shreds. August looked around to see what had become of the boy. Ben was on his hands and knees trying to stand up. August was thinking he needed to recover the sword but wasn't sure how far it had been thrown. Neither did he want to go into the darkness toward the sounds he heard coming from the fight in the midst of the graveyard without the sword in hand. Just then he heard what sounded like a yelp of pain and the fighting seemed to be over. There was dead silence. August instinctively went to Ben and was going to help him up and get him out of the cemetery. As August made it to Ben and pulled him to his feet, a figure appeared out of the darkness and stood gazing at August and Ben. "So, this is my descendant lucky enough to be born on Halloween," the ominous figure said, as he stood partially in the shadows. "Have to say, I can see the resemblance." "Who are you?" August asked, preparing to run with Ben in tow, sensing it would be of no benefit. "I am that young man's great-great-great-grandfather, Steinmann Demetrius Hansen. And, you must be the huntsman that has been trailing Leandro," the man said. "I am," August said carefully. "Then this must belong to you," the man said, as he stepped fully from the shadow, throwing the sword, sticking it firmly in the ground at August's feet. "You may have need of it again. I am confident Leandro will not be back for the boy, but he may be determined to settle the score with you soon enough." "And you, will I need it for you? Why are you here? What did you do with Leandro?" August asked. "No, I will be of no concern to you after this night. I will go my way once the witching hour is past and the boy is of no use to Leandro," the man reassured August. "I am the one who turned Leandro into what he now is. It was by sheer accident, I assure you, and I have no little regret over the matter. But I could not let him succeed in passing the curse on to my descendant in order to lift his own curse. If he had, I too would suffer consequences unspeakable. The moment the curse would pass from Leandro to my descendant, my physical form would be destroyed and I would be cast into hell forever without means to quench my horrid thirst. Selfish, maybe, but we did save the boy here from a cursed existence, did we not?" the man said, before quickly turning and slipping into the darkness. "Wait. What of Leandro?" August hollered after him. There was no response, and all was silent again except for the normal sounds of the night. August looked down at Ben, who was looking back up at him in wide-eyed amazement. "Don't be afraid, son. At least not of me," August said, in the most comforting tone he could manage. "Come, let's have a seat on the bench and I'll try to explain things to you the best I can." August proceeded to tell Ben all about how Leandro was a vampire, and how Leandro had become aware that the vampire, who they had just been speaking to, was the one who made Leandro a vampire, and had a descendant who would be turning 13 years of age on this Halloween. Leandro had discovered that if he were to drink blood from the descendant of the vampire that had passed the curse on to him before midnight on Halloween, he would return to being a normal human again, and his curse would be lifted. August went on to explain that in doing so, Leandro would have had to leave Ben alive to take on the curse, and Ben would become a vampire. August explained to Ben that he also was aware of this circumstance because he had been given an old book of spells that had a prophecy of such an event written in the back of the book. August went on to reveal that he was the man that yelled at Ben that night in the cemetery at the beginning of October, and had been watching out for him ever since. He told Ben of Anna, and how he had been on Leandro's trail for many years. About the time August was wrapping up his story, Ben and August heard some giggles and talking heading their way from the path that led into the cemetery. "Someone's coming," August said in a hushed tone. "Oh my gosh! That's Brittany and her friends," Ben exclaimed. I completely forgot about them. August gave Ben a slightly confused look and said, "Okay son, I must go now. You'll be okay. I'll hang around and keep an eye on you for a while from a distance, till I know the coast is clear. It was nice to meet you." August stuck his hand out to Ben for shaking. "No, wait. You can't go, you have to help me explain what happened to Brittany." "To everyone?" Ben pleaded desperately. "No son, I am afraid you are on your own with that one. You might want to think about it some before you tell anyone. By the way, I like your costume," August said, as he turned and slipped into the darkness. Ben was still standing, looking off in the direction August had went when the girls came through the cemetery gate. "Hey Goof, what's your damage? Why you still in that costume?" Brittany asked, embarrassed for her friends to see him in it. Ben just turned around slowly, with no apology in his voice and said, "It's a long story, you wouldn't believe it if I told you." The end. Please feel free to contact the author via email at midnightanywhere@yahoo.com with comments or questions regarding the book.